Today, again, we will open the Holy Book and we will continue listening to God's story. We're in the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Bible, and the portion for today is Numbers 25, 26, and 27. We will mostly be dealing with chapter 25 because my sermon is titled God's Story, Baal of Peor. Baal of Peor. This sounds strange already, right? So what we will be doing is studying chapter 25 and looking for the message that God is bringing across through this ancient story. Let's read the first three verses, Numbers 25, verses 1, 2, and 3. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. What do you remember about Peor? What is Peor? What is Baal? Who is Baal? If you follow this term up to this moment, you would discover that the last time we saw this name in the book of Numbers, chapter 23. Let's read verses 27 and 28. And Balak said to Balaam, "Come now, I will take you to another place. Perhaps it will please God that you may curse them for me from there." So Balak took Balaam to the top of Peor, which overlooks the desert. So what do we have? Peor is a place. It's a mountain. And if you follow the complete story, it's the third mountain that Balak took Balaam to try to curse the people of God, try to curse Israel. So Peor is a place where curse was initiated against Israel. And now Israel is worshiping the Baal of Peor. You know, how was it possible? When we go even further into the history, we find in Numbers chapter 22, verse 41, the following. Numbers 22, 41. And in the morning, Balak took Balaam and brought him up to Bamoth Baal. And from there he saw a fraction of the people. So when this specialist in curses came, Balak, the Moabite king, took him to what? To Bamoth Baal. What's that? Well, we immediately recognize the Baal, right? Baal is a deity. Well, the literal translation is Lord. So there were many Baals that the people of Canaan worshipped in different places. So the king of Moab brought this specialist to the sacred places where Baal was worshipped. And from those points, a curse was about to go out. When you look at different translations, for example, New King James Version says, the high places of Baal. Usually, instead of the phrase, Bamoth is a transliteration. It's not a translation. This is how it sounds. In Hebrew, it's Bamot. Bamot, plural form. And the translation is high places of Baal. So throughout the Bible, where would pagans worship their gods? On high places, on tops of mountains. And Balak took Balaam to these high places of Baal, centers of demonic worship. And Peor was one of those three Bamot, high places. So, how could it happen? I ask the question again. That the place that was used to bring curse on the people of God became the object of worship of the people of God. How was it possible? Here's the background story. The book of Numbers, in this case, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 4 and 5. Deuteronomy 23, 4 and 5. Because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt. And because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Peor, from Peor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. But the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loved you. So we learn from here that those high places, including Peor, was used to curse Israel. And it would have happened. The curse would have happened if God had not protected Israel. The text says that God turned the curse into a blessing. Here's the question. What right did God have to be able to protect Israel from this witchcraft? Let's listen to Balaam himself. Numbers 23:23. For there is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what God has wrought. If you take this version, which is English Standard Version, it could mean that Balaam admits his inability. He says basically, I have tried some witchcraft, it does not work. There is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. But the truth of the matter is that in the original, in Hebrew language, instead of against Jacob and against Israel, there is this small word, which is be in the original, and it means simply in. So the literal translation reads, for there is no enchantment in Jacob, no divination in Israel. Therefore, only God is able to do what he wants to do. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what God has wrought. God had the right to protect Israel from these curses because there was no divination, there was no paganism, there was no witchcraft in Israel itself. And because Israel was free of this kind of guilt, Balaam was not successful and God did not let the curse happen. But the Bible further tells the following. Numbers 23, verses 15 and 16. Moses said to them, have you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. When, during his 3 attempts, Balaam could not succeed in bringing the curse on Israel, because there was no reason for that, because Israel was free from paganism at that point. Balaam then gave what? An advice. Balaam gave an advice to Balak, and he suggested that women would be used to bring about the curse on Israel. Sounds a little bit strange, right? But we need to know that Balaam still found a way to curse Israel by luring God's people into paganism, so that there was a reason for the curse to become a reality. So before we proceed to analyzing Numbers 25, the first 3 verses that we read, we need to understand that this is a story of how the curse found its way to Israel. This is how the believers of God open the door for the curse. So, if you knew that there is this Baal of Peor, the place and the worship service that was used to curse you so that you will be defeated, would you worship that place and that deity? I mean, no one in his or her right mind wouldn't do it. You would not go to the place where they want to curse you. You would not worship there. You would not serve that deity. You would not engage in the witchcraft that could bring you curse, would you? This would be, you should not be in your right mind to do that, right? So here's the question then. How does it happen? How can a person of God become a target for satanic curse? How does apostasy happen? Let's read together. So we're going back to Numbers 25:1. 25:1. It says, when Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. If we use a different translation, for example, NIV, New International Version, it says, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality. So this was the first step. And when you look at it, fornication or sexual immorality, breaking God's laws about intimacy, right? This is a social sphere. It's not witchcraft. It's not paganism. It's not demon worship. It's not Satan worship. It's a matter of feelings, being drawn to someone in a very physical way. It's a matter of violating some of the commandments of God, relating to, describing the sphere of intimacy, sexual life specifically. So the first step was, at first glance, it had nothing to do with paganism. But then followed the second step, Numbers 25:2. 25:2. These women that engaged in fornication, in sexual immorality with the people of Israel, they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. So the next step was attending pagan rituals, pagan sacrifices. Again, there is no worshipping pagan deities, no conscious choice to become one of them, of the pagans. But if you already have friendship, if you already have feelings, if you already have a sexual relationship, then if a person says, would you accompany me to this event that my people are having? It's extremely hard to say no, right? And a person could be saying to himself, well, out of respect, and I will be just observing. And quite frankly, I'm interested, right? I haven't been to one of those yet, so it's going to be a new experience for me. I will just observe. I will not participate. So the second stage was attending pagan sacrifices. Let's go back to the verse, Numbers 25:2. What happened then? And the people ate. It's a festivity, right? It's a celebration. And the people of God, they began partaking of the meals. It's called exploring their national cuisine, right? What spices do they use? How does it taste? It's always interesting. You see, eating at the festival also could seem very innocent, right? So you attend the place, the function, you eat the food there. Never mind that the food was offered to idols before, but I mean, you are not an idol worshiper, right? You just analyze the food for what it is in terms of taste, calories, protein, fats, carbohydrates, and so forth, right? It's just food. What happened next? 25:2. The people ate, and then there is a call. And bowed down to their gods. And again, if you know who the true God is, if you know that these are all idols made by human hands, you could easily say to yourself, well, since I have already tasted what was sacrificed to idols, and nothing terrible happened, in my hearts of hearts, I do know that this is just a piece of gold or stone or whatever. This is just an idol. It's nothing, right? So me bowing down would mean only what? Respect to their traditions, to their customs, to their way of life. And again, we have such strong attraction to each other. I mean, it's not a big deal, right? It's not a big deal. And I'll do it only once. And then, verse number 3, Numbers 25:3. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor. The phrase that's used here is very interesting. What does it mean to yoke yourself? It means to join others who are pulling this wagon, chariot, or whatever. So the picture is of two animals that are joined together to pull the load. In reality, it means attachment, the same rules, the same lifestyle, the same service. So they were drawn to. As a result, they liked it. They became conscientious followers of Baal of Peor. Because whatever was offered was appealing, was interesting, was fun, and so forth. So how does apostasy begin? I'm sure that if the temptation was from worshiping God to worshiping Baal, everyone would say no. But since it was gradual, it was little by little, it was slow, it was in stages. Each new stage paved the way for the next one. And a person grows accustomed to this new experience. And if something used to be scary or not acceptable, now becomes familiar and could be even pleasurable and so forth. And it paves the way for the next step. How does apostasy happen? It occurs with small consecutive steps. And if a person does not stop, the person is bound to continue because it is very, very natural. There is a saying, give him a finger, he'll bite off the whole hand. Give him a finger, he'll bite off the whole arm. Well, it's a well-known Russian saying, of course, which is literally translated in this case. This is the nature of sin. If you yield just a little bit, it's taking more and more of you till it devours you completely. So, just one date with the wrong person that you know is wrong for you. Just one party, just one drink, just one dose, just one commandment that's broken. And it doesn't seem too serious at the beginning. But then, step by step, slowly and slowly, a person is sucked into a totally different lifestyle. And all of a sudden, there is no desire to worship God. There is this joining in with the Baal of Peor. So what happened as a result? Numbers 25, verse 3. 25:3. It says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. When they yoked themselves to Baal of Peor, it says the anger of the Lord was kindled. What does it mean? What does the phrase, the anger of the Lord? Let's remember the context. Do you remember what was the goal of Balak and Balaam? To bring curse, to curse Israel, right? And the way to do it, when he failed with sorcery, he gave the advice to lure God's people into service of Baal, so that the curse will be self-inflicted. So whose work is the curse? Who brings the curse in this sequence of events? Who is Baal? It's an idol, but moreover, it's a deity, and moreover, it is a demon. Deuteronomy chapter 23 says clearly that when people worshipped idols, other gods, gods of other nations. They worshipped demons. So whose working is the curse? So remembering this, let's read two statements further on in the biblical narrative. And the first one is 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. 1 Chronicles 21, 1. Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Who did that? Satan. Okay, remember that. And then let's read 2 Samuel 24, 1. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go number Israel and Judah. Whose work is it here? Yeah, it's becoming difficult, right? So it's the same incident, it's the same story, it's the same event. In one place it is said that Satan incited David, but here it says the anger of the Lord was kindled, and he incited David. He is who? It's very messed up, right? And the difficulty is that depending on the version that you read, instead of he, it could be it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and it incited David. It meaning the anger of the Lord, not the Lord. We don't have time to solve this puzzle, but what we do see very clearly is that the reality of the anger of the Lord is directly related to what? To Satan. Because again, Satan incited, the anger of the Lord incited David. So the anger of the Lord and the workings of Satan are very closely related. Sin provokes the anger of God. God's anger is his reaction to sin. And for that matter, if you are angry because of someone's sin, your anger could be easily called a just and righteous anger. If it's against the sin, if it's against breaking God's law. So God's reaction to the reality of sin is his anger. That's one. Now, number two, what happens when a person sins in a person's relation to Satan? What does sin do to a person in the context of Satan? Remember, Baal is one of the demons that wants to curse the people of God. So what does sin do in relation to Satan? It opens the door. When there is sin, it opens the door for Satan to act. It gives Satan power to act. It gives legitimacy to Satan's workings. So sin provokes the anger of the Lord and gives Satan the right to curse. That's how Balaam was ultimately successful. When he tried to use obvious methods, they did not work because Israel was not guilty. But then he thought of the idea that would bring curse upon Israel. And slowly, in small steps, over time, the curse was brought to Israel. That's the story of Baal of Peor. Now, what was God's reaction? What happened after that? Let's go to Numbers 25:4. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." There is a question that I'm asked often. Is this fair? That the chiefs of the people would be punished because the people joined themselves to Baal. If we stop reading there, the problem stays. But if we go on reading, in verse 25, we find the following. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor." First point, very important. Who was tasked with making a decision about punishment? Judges, right? So it was a matter of judicial process. The case needed to be studied. How do you tell apart between a person who is just visiting and attending those sacrificial festivals and a person who accepted this as his or her new religion and lifestyle? How do you tell apart the person who has yoked himself with Baal? Because only these ones were to be punished. You would need to investigate. You would need to ask questions. You would need the process of discovery and so forth. So, what we need to always remember that only those people who have dedicated themselves to knowing God, knowing His laws, knowing all commandments and so forth, they still decided to join another religion. Only those were punished. And then when we go on reading this chapter, the book of Numbers, chapter 25, verse 9 says the following: "Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. So, who brought the punishment? It was supernatural, natural. It was a plague. It came from supernatural place. It was from spiritual realm. So we see that the punishment, that the consequences of this worship was a supernatural phenomenon. This is God's reaction. No injustice, not by association, strictly after discovery, after due diligence, after judges collected information and discovered those who are serving Baal for good, who switched, who flipped, who changed sides. And then the punishment came. There is another figure in this story, in this chapter, that is needed to be looked at. Let's go to Numbers 25, verses 6 through 8. 6 through 8. "And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it. He rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the men of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the men of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague of the people of Israel was stopped. Again, a passage that troubles readers. Was it right for Phinehas to do this? To understand this, let's try to picture the scene. It's one thing to go to Moabites, to Midianites, and engage in whatever they're engaging over there. But it's a totally different thing when this woman, the idol worshiper, the demon worshiper, was brought to the people of Israel to engage in sinful activities. Remember, a plague is in progress. A plague is in progress. Then the whole congregation is at the tabernacle doing what? Weeping, praying, asking for a way to amend the situation, to bring solution, to repent and ask for God's forgiveness. So they're all there. And then this person, his name is Zimri, as we learn further in verse 14, he brings this woman, and he goes, where? Where was the tabernacle located? Do you remember? The answer is in the center. In the center of the camp. Tabernacle, the Levites, and then all other tribes. So, he takes her when the plague is in progress, when everyone is weeping, and they both appear there, and then they go to his tent and they perform the act of sin. This is what was happening. So, it was deliberate. It was for public display. It was a challenge. It was a mockery to God. It was breaking all, God and human laws of decency. And when Phinehas saw that, he put an end to it. Did he have authority to do that? Now, can you imagine like an elder or a deacon, following someone and going after them into the bedroom and then, enacting the punishment? Let's read from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verses 8 through 10. If any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns that is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose, and you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in the office in those days, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. Then you shall do according to what they declare to you, and so forth. So the priests, they carried duties of judges. And remember, the whole case was given to judges to solve. So Phinehas was acting in his full right, in his full authority. He carried out the judgment, and he had the authority to do this as a priest. He was Eleazar's son, Aaron's, the high priest's grandson. He acted within his authority. We need to remember that the people of God at that time were not only a spiritual body, but also a government, also a country, also a state. They had judges, they had police, and so forth. There, at that time, Phinehas acted in accordance with the instructions and with the format that the society was living. Our topic today is God's story, colon, Baal of Peor. There are very many lessons that are still valid for us today. As we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 8, and then 11 and 12, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall. I'm sure that those who eventually yoked themselves to Baal of Peor, they thought and they were confident that they are strong enough in faith to not suffer harm as a result of these contacts with pagans. Many people think that they will not suffer even if they yield a little bit to their friends, to their lovers, to their co-workers, to the society around. But Paul is urging, he's warning, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, because it's easy to fall. The slope from God is gradual, and the apostasy is unnoticeable. Therefore, this story, it gives a challenge to me personally to analyze my life and to see if there are no cracks in the door opening for devil to get into. If the doors are not opened because people get used to their new format of life, and then the next downfall is easier than the first one. May God keep us all safe from sin, from curses, from destruction, and from death. Amen.